We'll present kind of the bare bones of the model intuitively, and then for PhD students who actually would need to know this more in detail for their comprehensive exams, I've noticed that people write about this, but they don't seem to know what they are talking about. So I feel an obligation to do something about this. In winter, we can have a special class where I actually walk you through the model itself and the various subtleties that it presents. But today, I'm just going to present the bare bones. So we had the gold standard. We then had the Bretton Woods system, which was leaking even in the 60s. And people like Mandel, Mandel actually won a Nobel Prize for some of this work and other work he did around the 60s about market integration, etc., and monetary union. Fleming was a very creative economist too, but he did not win the Nobel Prize because he didn't do as much work as Mandel did. But both of them had this keen insight that when you have capital flows, then it becomes more difficult to maintain a fixed exchange rate, but not all is lost. You can actually find clever ways to make policies stick. So usually Mandel-Fleming model is presented as something that deals with the impossible trinity that you cannot have fixed exchange rate, capital flows, and autonomous monetary, in parentheses I should add, fiscal policy, in a world that we live in. You can have only two of the three. But that is oversimplifying things quite a bit. What the approach fundamentally does is to try to restore this automaticity in the balance of payment system. But in order to do so, you have to assume capital mobility. And then you have to ask yourself what happens under fixed exchange rate system and what happens under floating exchange rate systems, things that I won't go over in detail today. But I will simply indicate how the model really is conceived. The model is conceived in three ways. First of all, we have something called IS, which really, I stands for investment, S is for saving. So where we have equilibrium, or we can call this the real sector of the economy. And then we have something called LM, which is equilibrium. Monetary sector. In a closed economy, that's all you have. In a closed economy, we can draw a diagram, for example. I won't explain how you get these diagrams, but if you have interest rates here and income, aggregate national income here, your IS curve will look something like this, downward sloping. Your LM curve would look something like this, and then you have an equilibrium that will give you the rate of interest in the economy and also the equilibrium income in the economy. If you want to increase income, then you can actually push investment this way. That way you increase income, and you also increase interest rates somewhat. Obviously, you can tell from the diagram how quickly you can do something or how easily you can do something really depends on the slopes of these curves, right? The steeper the LM curve is, for example, the more you have to increase the interest rate, and the more you have to actually have stimulated policies to get an increase in income. With a steep IS curve, if it is more steep, then you can actually, let's just do it. If it was like this, then if you shifted this way, if you could actually shift it this way, then the slope itself is not going to matter. But if the LM curve itself was much, much steeper, then you would actually need a great deal more flexibility. Okay, even this closed economy model looks complicated enough. But when you have an open economy, you also have an external setting. So let's call this BB, balance. Equilibrium in balance of payments. So the challenge that was presented after the war, and the formulation really came from James Mead, who was a great economist, another Nobel laureate. He formulated the problem in terms of maintaining both internal and external balance. So internal balance would be an economy with full employment and price stability. Okay, this is almost as good as capitalism can ever get. And the idea was to have this kind of reformed capitalism after the experience of the Great Depression. And external balance means that countries will not be in tremendous pressure to adjust domestically because their external sectors are too out of balance. If you just look at the reality today, our external sector is very much out of balance, and we have not really adjusted. And that creates the problem of what really might happen to this economy, starting with the value of dollar all the way to output and employment and people's life prospects, all these things. So Mead's idea was to create a more humane, more civilized kind of capitalism where we could maintain these internal and external balances through various arrangements among the countries and timely policy interventions. But he was not terribly clear as to how to do it, and his analysis was not dynamic. So what Mundell and Fleming did was to make this analysis explicitly dynamic, that is what would happen over time. And they also did something that was very interesting, as I said before, by introducing capital flows. They made it look like it could happen automatically, the external balance. But it wasn't quite as simple as it turned out to be. But Mundell, in the meantime, derived a great theoretical result, which is called the assignment problem. I think that is important to know. Mundell said, look, suppose we cannot really devalue our currency, and we don't want to devalue our currency, so that's not a policy instrument we want to use. Is it possible for us to balance the external sector of our economy and also produce full employment internally? And surprisingly, his answer was yes, if there is capital mobility. It doesn't have to be a great deal of capital mobility either. If capital is even slightly mobile, you can show theoretically that you can achieve both internal balance and external balance. So first claim is that you can achieve both, just put full employment, with price stability and external balance. But through an explicitly dynamic analysis, Mundell showed, and it's a beautiful, beautiful paper. It's just graphs. So if you just know geometry and have good economic intuition, you can follow it. It's called The Appropriate Use of Monetary and Fiscal Policy. The second proposition he came up with, very useful, that for internal balance, use fiscal policy, that is, use government expenditure, budget deficits or taxes, basically budget deficit. For external balance, use monetary policy. And this is really the assignment. And Mundell shows very beautifully that because different policies have different effects on different sectors of the economy, by using this, you actually achieve a stable arrangement. Whereas if you reverse it, if you use monetary policy for internal balance and fiscal policy for external balance, you actually screw things up. The system is not stable. So this actually, both these results are very, very significant results and very beautiful results and very useful results. They show that economics as a discipline actually can have something useful to say about the real world. But I think the problem is that when you have a huge amount of capital flows, then of course monetary policy cannot be used for domestic purposes at all, which shouldn't have been anyway according to the assignment problem. But fiscal policy itself also cannot work as well as it is expected to. So in a world of volatility of exchange rates, volatility of capital flows, you really have a great deal more problem as a domestic government trying to balance things. The problem is the same for everybody except for the US, because even after the demise of Bretton Woods, for lack of any other alternative, dollar became also, again, the key currency of the world. So everybody was more or less willing to settle their external accounts in dollar terms until the rise of euro. Now it is a good question what would happen, because now there is actually a rival currency for the dollar for the first time since the Second World War. For a while it seemed yen was going to be a challenger, but that fizzled out, and I don't think that will become a serious issue again. What might happen is that there would be a currency basket like dollar and euro and yen and Chinese yuan, and together they might actually become a kind of unit of account in which we want to settle our international payments. But of course the logical thing to do would be to have something like a truly central bank for the world, and that central bank would issue its own currency, a truly international currency, which would be allocated equitably among the different countries, and then surplus and deficit countries would be held equally accountable for imbalances, not just the deficit countries, which would of course help the US, because we are a deficit country right now. So anyway, all this is very complicated. International economics is a fascinating but extremely complex field. It takes many years of study. I hope that you learned something in the last few minutes. And to digest it, of course, takes a little while. Let me see if there are any questions, any part of this exposition that is not intuitively clear.
Can you clarify again, Dr. Khan, the assignment problem? What is the problem? Can you just
The assignment problem is how to solve this in maintaining internal and external balance when you cannot use devaluation of your currency. Because you can always fix your external balance by devaluing if you're in deficit, if you devalue enough. Okay. You may not want to devalue that farther. And sometimes devaluation would lead to contraction of output. This is also something interesting in international economics. And Mundell's point was that you have to assign monetary and fiscal policy correctly. But if capital is even slightly mobile, that would work, theoretically. but in the real world, it might take a while. Everything takes time in the real world. But in the theoretical world, we assume that everything happens instantaneously or quickly over time. We begin the second half, and as I promised, our speaker today will be Professor Peggy Cole, who knows English much better than anyone here. I can guarantee you that. She was a professor of English at Arapaho Community College for many years, also the chair of the department. And after she left that job, she did not stop, of course, teaching, but she also picked up a new job for public good and in public interest. I should also introduce Jim Cole, who is her husband, and also a dear friend and a PhD student at for Bell School here. They are both here, so we got 2 for 1. And that will add to the general knowledge and merriment. I should mention that Peggy won against tremendous odds because she was a newcomer. She didn't have the connections and contacts that you need in every kind of politics nowadays, it seems. But against all odds, she won, and of course we are glad that she did. She has done various things in her capacity in this city government and has many more ideas. She has a few things to say. I already handed out, I think, 2 sheets, which you probably can take a look at. And I will just turn it over to Peggy and ask her to share her wisdom and her ideas with us. Thank you, Peggy.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll stand because I project better. I don't talk very loud. But I just want to say one thing first, and then I want to make sure you have time to read the handout, and so we have a little context of who I am and so forth. And then I'm going to share a few thoughts with you, and then we just have question answer, if that's okay. But first thing I wanted to do was to ask how many of you have voted in an election in this country or another country or whatever. Okay, and some of you voted in the recent election here. Yay, okay, and maybe you won on some of what you voted and lost on some of what you voted, but I'm glad you did that. How many of you have participated in protests anyplace? It could be anti-war protest, anti-raising of the tuition protest, anti-bad food in the cafeteria protest, but anyway. So protests of different kinds, and it's really good to see so many of you already very actively involved. So I know some of you have already glanced at the one handout that Dr. Khan gave you, but this is the one in particular you might like to look at. The other one here of particular interest is the fact that in this organizational chart for the city of Littleton, which is just southwest of here, the citizens are shown at the top. I mean, they could have just left the citizens off, but they put the citizens on. The citizens essentially are the ones that everybody else, city council, all the employees have to answer to. But anyway, if you would take just a few minutes to glance back over this, and if there's something that you might want to ask about later, maybe just put a little mark and we'll come back to that. And when you finish looking at that, if you look out, and some of you I know have already read it thoroughly, then I wanted to share a few more words about my thinking on voting and so forth. Littleton has about 41,000, a little over 41,000 people. It was founded about 150 years ago, but it became a home rule city in 1959. So we have our own charter, we're home rule, which means we get to decide a lot of things that home rule cities that are not home rule in Colorado don't get to decide. The state legislature makes rules that apply to cities that aren't home rule cities. So we have lots that we have to talk about all the time, policy issues and budget issues and all kinds of issues. The largest part of our budget is personnel costs, and a huge part of that is for police and fire emergency. But we still have lots of issues to talk about. We are pretty much a landlocked city. Denver has lots of places it can still expand. Highlands Ranch can expand. A lot of cities can expand, but we're surrounded pretty much and can't do much expansion except possibly infilling and putting in high-rise stuff. And a big part of the election last fall had to do with, do people want us to keep the character we now have, or do a lot of high-density, high-rise infill? And the people who want to keep the character of the city dominated in the election. But that's just a little more background that's on that sheet. What I wanted to share with you is something more at a philosophic level, if you will. So I'd like to quote the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. I know a lot of you probably have the whole first part memorized, but I still want to read it and emphasize a part of that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I'm going to repeat that last part, really important. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That declaration applies not only to federal government, but also to all other levels of government in this country. The people have the responsibility to protect these rights, and that responsibility begins with local government, which provides the greatest opportunity for citizens to participate. And as I pointed out to you, Littleton's city organizational chart has citizens right at the top over everything. At the bottom of the handout that I gave you, or that Dr. Kine gave you, I offered several suggestions at that very bottom for getting more citizens involved in government, because it becomes very easy for people to just sort of say, well, we elected you, you go do it. But government needs to hear from the people, needs to have a sense of the pulse of the people. We don't want to wait until everybody's really angry and then hear from the people. We want to be in touch with them throughout. So I have a few more observations to share besides the bullets that are at the bottom of that one page. For the recent election in this country, we saw citizens organize at the grassroots level. How many of you were involved at all in the recent campaign here? I know quite a few of you were from other countries, but you were. And can you tell us what kinds of things you did?
It's pretty straightforward. I mean, It was a very well-organized grassroots campaign with an office, basically 3 doors, 3 blocks from my house. I could walk in at any time, basically volunteer. Did a lot of online contributions as well. You know, did what I could when I could, kind of things like that.
So did you take yard signs to people and go door to door?
They didn't do as much of the door-to-door work as, you know, made calls and, you know, basically contributed actually more than that because of my limited time, but,
Yeah.
you know, essentially, you know, our neighborhood was pretty well organized,
Yeah.
even before I even walked into the campaign office, so.
Now, you're not right out of high school or something, so you've been through several elections, right?
Right.
So did you notice a difference this time versus previous elections, more involvement?
Well, yeah, I think so. There was a lot more, I mean, just from the model of number of people that came by my door even.
Yeah,
I mean, my door got knocked on twice a weekend at least,
wow,
for at least 6 to 8 weeks.
so,
Somebody always came by my door every Saturday and every Sunday.
okay, and
And
lots
it-
of phone calls?
Oh
and-
yeah,
Yeah,
lots of phone calls, lots and lots and lots of emails too.
yeah,
Can I interject a point on this, Peggy? This is a very, very important characteristic of this last campaign in terms of what they call contact. The candidates contacting the individual public. And there's been some polling data that's just been released in terms of how people voted based on contact. The higher degree of contact by the campaign to an individual group raised their participation in the election and the voting for the specific candidate. So it's truly extraordinary. Excuse me.
but anyway, thank you for sharing that. So we saw people organize at the grassroots level, trying to get people to know about the candidate, these various candidates or issues. People were campaigning for issues, not necessarily for candidates, some of each. Just as people had gotten organized at the grassroots level when this country was founded. Really important concept. So in this election, we wound up giving a new mandate to the U.S. administration and the U.S. legislature, as well as to many state governments. Now in Littleton and all the home rule cities in Colorado vote in the odd years. So we didn't, those of you who voted, you didn't vote in any municipal elections for city council or whatever, although you may have had ballot issues about raising school taxes or raising, asking to keep money so that it could be spent on X or Y or Z, but no elected officials in municipal government in the even years. Now, we had a fairly significant, fairly decisive vote for the national elections, state representatives and so forth. So one of the temptations is to allow the majority to just take over. And if you do that, you can potentially have what's called the tyranny of the majority. And it's my belief, as it is for the belief of at least some great political thinkers, that you want to try to avoid a tyranny of a majority. I mean, they've got to vote, but how can we guard against having that tyranny? We have to ensure that all voices are heard. President-elect Obama has already said he will listen to those who did not vote for him. He'll listen to the ones who did too, but he's going to listen to what people who didn't support him have to say also. He's committed to appointing people to his cabinet who will challenge him. We too, citizens too, must encourage those who disagree with us to speak out, because such challenges encourage us to think more carefully about the strengths and weaknesses of our ideas. In the late 19th century, John Stuart Mill, Englishman, in his essay on liberty, discussed the pitfalls, for example, of censorship, where the majority is censoring ideas. When I was growing up and we had the Cold War and so forth, people didn't want people to read anything the communists wrote, thinking that this would somehow, be stronger than the individual who reads it and corrupt them. But Mill would have argued, and I certainly argued, that being familiar with what somebody else has to say, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of what they have to say, helps you make a stronger position all the way around. You may adopt certain ideas of the so-called opposition, but not because somebody has, seduced you into believing it, but because you've really carefully analyzed what somebody is saying that you were disagreeing with. If we are to benefit from the expression of ideas, while we're trying to get everybody talking, the parallel or concomitant obligation is to try to have people be as educated as they can be. Because you cannot weigh ideas well if you don't have broad understanding, broad range of knowledge, and help people develop critical thinking skills that allow them to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of arguments and ideas. Some people said, well, Obama didn't have any experience. Well, I for one think he had lots of important experience, but what's equally important to me is that he and other people have critical thinking skills and the will to want to listen to what various points of view say, but his critical thinking skills will help him evaluate the direction to go, the programs to put in place, and so forth. And I want to share with you way back now from when I was a freshman in college. I recall a final exam that I had in my second semester of freshman biology. I hadn't totally made up my mind at that point whether I was going to major in English or in math, but I knew I wasn't going to major in science. So I took biology for non-science majors. And we all were in a huge, huge room. It was a small school, but all the science majors and the non-majors were all in this huge, huge, huge room. And in one half of the room were the science majors, and the other half were the non-science majors. And our teacher was explaining the process of our exam. And we had a multiple choice exam. Would you all like multiple choice exams? They can be pretty difficult, can't they? It was difficult, those questions on that multiple choice exam. But the tough part was under each piece, and we didn't have the old fill in the little bubbles. We'd circle the answer, and then underneath we had to write why that answer was correct. Well, the grades were down significantly at that point, right? And all the science majors gave a sigh of relief because they didn't like this exam that we were, the format of our exam. Theirs apparently was a much easier exam than ours was. But the critical thinking skills and knowledge combination on that kind of test, really important. So what I've said to you is that we need to find ways to hear from all the voices and to weigh what those voices are saying, the strengths and weaknesses of arguments. And at the bottom again on that sheet that I gave you, I've listed several things that I think help engage the voices. It's important, and because of all I did at the college for 36 years before I retired, I didn't have time to become involved in city activities, city issues and so forth. It was about a little over a year after I retired that I started becoming engaged with city issues, and it started with a Walmart issue. Are we going to put this Walmart up next to our beloved park or not? And everybody had a view on it. People didn't know me so well because I hadn't been involved in things, but during all that process I spoke publicly a few times, and I spoke publicly after that. But I was a bit behind the 8 ball because people hadn't rubbed elbows with me, so to speak. Now that I'm on council, I'm trying to be more and more involved in many ways, including, as I put on here, I helped at a car wash to raise money for the family of someone who was